All right. Hello, and welcome to this very special edition of This Week in Intelligent Investing. I'm joined here by Mario Cibelli of Marathon Equity Partners. I'm lucky to be able to call Mario both a mentor and a friend. He's taught me great lessons in building the business side of a firm, and he's a master of scuttlebutt and has shared some of his secrets, though not all of them. His advice on accessing and building relationships with management, along with being creative and triangulating unique pieces of information, have been instrumental in making me a better investor. Mario's scuttlebutt is so uniquely awesome, it was immortalized in the book Netflixed. I had to look up the history, but we first formally met in late spring of 2016 over Grubhub, specifically around one of the several rumors about Amazon attacking the food delivery vertical. We'll talk more about food delivery later, but first, let's talk about some history. When we picked today, Mario told me that while we're recording on April Fool's, this is no joke, today is the 24th anniversary of you launching Marathon Equity Partners. Almost at marathon length, measured in years, and a truly incredible accomplishment launching at a pretty modest scale. You've been through so much in markets, performed through it all. Why don't you start by telling us a little bit about how you did it and what you've learned along the way?
Yeah, thanks. That's a nice intro. And just to be technically clear, we launched the main fund on April 1st, 1997. The firm came later, but that was the main fund that still exists today. So the main fund is years old today. So, I may have a shot of tequila while we're talking to celebrate a little bit. So sorry, what did you ask me again?
Yeah, so why don't you tell us how you did it, right? Incredible longevity through a stock market bubble in the early years, the dot-com fallout afterwards, the housing bubble, and then crisis afterwards. Why don't you tell us a little bit about what you've learned along the way?
Oh, okay. Geez, where do I start on that? I guess I would say, rather than go through all the details of the markets and what I've seen and everything, I'd kind of say I'm a stock picker first. I've always been a stock picker. The portfolio management, and the firm came later. I still love kind of being in the trenches and analyzing businesses and investments. And we've done a good job for our investors over time. And I got at least another 10 years left in me, and so I really enjoy what we do. I feel privileged to have done it for as long as I have. In preparing for this, I did put together a little bit of a list of things, a stock picker's guide for surviving 20 plus years in the business. So I can talk about some things there if you want, or I can talk a little bit more about my background and how I came up. And you tell me where you want to go.
I'm going to have to say you got to share the stock picker's guide first, and then we could talk a little more about your background.
Okay. Well, first thing I wrote down was, anchor with great investors. And I think many of whom will be individual investors and not necessarily professional allocators. Not every fund is able to check all the boxes when it comes to attracting the big allocators. And, individual investors will keep you in the game as long as you're doing a good job for them. So, our 24 years in business has been supported by some really good investors that have stuck with us for an awfully long period of time. Another thing kind of struck me when I was thinking about this a bit is, to sit and or associate with a great group of individuals. And I think, Twitter potentially allows this to occur more easily than it had in the past. I was fortunate to sit with a guy by the name of Bob Rabati at Rabati & Company, and Bob was a great person to learn from. He was CFO at Cebelli & Company many, many years ago, and that's how I met him. And Bob doesn't have a dishonest bone in his body, and it was just a great group of people there that I learned from. There was a guy named Alan Weber who had, one of the best track records on Wall Street you probably never heard of. A guy named Jeff Jacobowitz at Simcoe. These guys, Ben and Zach at Spruce House, who've gone on to do big, amazing things. And I started talking to them when, they were still in college. But it was just a great place to be. And I would say, if you could find a group of people to associate with and others that are like-minded, that challenge and listen and learn new things, that's that's really important. And early on, when I had my fund and launched it, I launched it in this group of individuals, and that was a really nice thing to do. Um, I'd say another thing that is super important: put your investors first and never compromise on ethics. I think that's absolutely critical. Um, know what you're best at, know what you're good at, find your niche, and just mine it. Um, when you find your kind of risk, take it all day. And this is probably one of the harder lessons I've learned in my career on many occasions. If I was to be self-critical, I think we've taken too little risk relative to our knowledge. And I would say our investors probably don't fully appreciate how risk averse we've been over time. And we've kept our gross exposure quite low relative to most hedge funds. I would say maintaining an emotional balance in times of stress, not getting caught up in the madness of the moment, is very important. And I think intellectual honesty is crucial in that at all times. I would say stay humble. Is another one. I think that's super important. And when your job seems easy, remind yourself of how difficult the task truly is. And when things seem absolutely hopeless, remember you at your best self, and remember what it's like to be at the top of your game. Another one I wrote down is to keep overhead low so you can ride out the downdrafts. We've always kind of done that, even as we've kind of built the firm up and invested people and overhead over time. And the last one I wrote, I kind of just said, find a sustainable way to dissipate stress: exercise, hike, meditation, sports. This job could consume you if you let it. So don't let it. You have to have something out there away from this to deal with the stress. So I don't know. That was an incomplete list of how to survive 2 decades in the business.
There's a lot of good stuff in there. So, obviously on the first couple, I'm thinking, and I've seen this of you and from you, relationships are incredibly important, like building and nurturing relationships and thinking about them many years down the line. Maybe, to expand on that a little, how do you feel that's, you talked about having great anchor investors as people, but also like associating with other really sharp investors, gave a couple examples, and then FinTwit as well. And I guess you unleashed Modest Proposal on us, the world. But maybe talk a little bit about like the role relationships have played, because it definitely seems to be something that stands out with you.
Yeah, well, look, I'd say as far as investments go, I like to develop good relationships with management teams, and we've had the pleasure of being associated with some great CEOs and teams over the years, and we didn't get access because we had billions of dollars under management, could own a huge chunk of their stock. It was because we added value, because we're good shareholders. We asked thoughtful questions, we pointed things out, and did that. So I'd say a lot of the relationships that I've built, I'd say have been with management teams. I probably have been, less kind of, at least historically, less kind of interested in talking to other managers. I think Twitter helped that out a lot. That part, well, I'm not sure what else to say on that.
How'd you end up at Twitter in the first place? Because you were really pretty early there in the grand scheme of things.
Yeah, I try to use new apps and new things, kind of ahead of the curve. I'm not like the most bleeding edge, cutting edge kind of user of new things, but I'm probably pretty early on the spectrum, and I have 4 kids, and I learned Snapchat pretty early on. It's kind of really hard to, it's non-intuitive to figure it out, but I get faster responses from my kids using Snapchat, so I've kind of figured out Snapchat a while ago, didn't own the shares. So I don't know. Yeah, Twitter. Twitter. I think I hit my 10-year anniversary not too long ago. We were pretty early, and then it went dormant and dark for a while, and then started using it again. And I just try to challenge myself and use new things and be aware of things as best I can without going, completely overboard.
Yeah, you do a good job staying young with exploring some of these things, and Definitely see that. One other thing that stands out to me, you talked about like finding your own setup and knowing your kind of risk. So like, is that something when you started 24 years ago that you had an idea of what your setup was? Or was there somewhere along the way that you're like, this is who I'm going to be. This is my setup and I know it and I'm going to repeat this over and again.
Yeah, well, there's all sorts of different styles, and I never kind of look down on a style that differs from me. I guess I was one of the folks that fit into that category of, you don't have to have a lot of eggs in your basket. You watch the basket pretty closely. So I've always been, I can't keep track of 30 different things. I think I can keep track of 10 things pretty well, and certainly five or six extremely well. And I always considered us to be about as good as anyone and on individual names, including the biggest, most successful funds that have a lot of dollars they throw behind research and analytics and real-time data to track things. That when I and my team get really focused on something, we can be as good as anyone. So that's always been a way that I've done it. I think it's been kind of a natural progression for me. I do remember certain companies early on in my career where I was kind of probably still developing, portfolio management skills and risk controls and whatnot. Where I saw an absolutely amazing setup, and I was like, well, where should I stop buying this thing? I mean, there's very limited downside risk, got really good upside. It was a company in Chicago, John Nuveen, a money management firm, and it doesn't make sense to go into all the details, but it was probably it's still considered one of the best risk reward trades I've ever made in my career. It was kind of a triple in 2 years, and I just kept buying more and more, and I think I had mid 25% of the fund in it, and I was just like, where do I stop? I mean, I could have half my fund in this thing, and then you kind of have to account for like things could clearly happen that you didn't count on and whatnot, and there could be, I guess, the potential for fraud or malfeasance or something that would be completely unexpected. So I guess I settled in, in the mid 20s at cost. That tends to be my kind of upper limit.
Yeah, and you take some pretty big swings. So that's an impressive one. I'm curious, could you like distill your kind of setup to a couple like key traits, a couple like key hallmarks that repeat themselves from one to the next?
Sorry, for concentrated positions or for the
more for like the kind of setup where you'd want to take a big swing.
I think yeah, mostly on those I really have to be really convinced it's just some great downside protection, that it's going to be hard to lose a significant amount of money that could be mark to market losses and whatnot. But the odds of a permanent capital loss being low with good upside, that to me is kind of the perfect setup. Now that's different from Netflix and Stitch Fix. And Stitch Fix, of course, is a current obsession where I think there's potentially massive upside, but I would say that there's clearly downside risks on that model. And Netflix in our portfolio, I think, was never more than 10% of the portfolio. So the things that we really swing hard on, I guess I feel that basically it's something we can't lose on, and we got a darn good shot at making some money, or I got some free calls or something that may pay off. Then to me, that's probably the best bet in the world. Now that may be a little bit of a mistake at times, because Netflix was I guess in theory, with hindsight, you look back and that was a super low risk investment. Look how much it's appreciated over time. But at the time, no one's kind of painting, there's not an exact answer of what the future is going to look like. So I would tend on some of these more challenger, disruptor, growth kinds of companies to be more cautious when establishing the position.
Yeah, you had a fantastic thread on Twitter. I think it was maybe like a month and a half, 2 months ago, about the challenges you'll face as a long-term holder in some of these younger growth companies, riffing off of your experience with Netflix. So like, how do you feel when it's time to like dig in and stay around versus time to move on to the next challenge? Like what sort of intuition have you developed for that over time?
Yeah, that's a good question. Hard to answer with precision. We model things pretty in a pretty detailed fashion. At the same time, like I don't want to be a slave to the model. Like if you just really go back in time and some of the things that have really worked out well, it's like the model didn't matter. You do the model to justify it, but really the business fundamentals and the team and the board and how things evolved over time and how competitive that organization was. It makes the model like the at least the original model like kind of worthless over time. It doesn't even matter. But you don't know the future, so you kind of map out some minimal justification. And I would tend to always have a bias towards conservatism. We've done it on Stitch Fix, and we'll talk about Stitch Fix later. I'm not trying to get us to jump to Stitch Fix now. But we have some minimal level of profitability that we see in the out years in our model, and like we can anchor off that. And that may or may not happen. The company may earn more than that or less than that. We've modeled it to less than the management team's long-term guidance that they've given on margins. But they could also miss it by a mile, and not necessarily in a negative way. They could grow a lot faster, and there's a lot more investment. They had a lot more countries than we've modeled. We've only modeled the U.S. and the U.K. We didn't model a third entry in Europe, a Germany or a Netherlands or something like that, or a France, which is very likely at one point. So it could be that they don't hit their margins, but they have way more, growth and revenues than we've modeled. So again, I think at least the way we like to do it is we want to have some quantitative justification for our interest in the business, but we don't want to be a slave to the model when you're looking at something that's kind of transformative and potentially changing, in front of your eyes.
That's such a good point, because when I think about Netflix, like where in a model would you have cliffed the number of DVDs they send by mail and focused on, subs and then inevitably ARPU on a digital streaming service? Like how could you do that?
Yeah, it's funny, right? Because it was subscription by the mail, then it was a hybrid service for some period of time, and then it's not a hybrid service anymore. It's a streaming service, and that is some of those things you really can't model. You make an attempt at it, but you look back over a long period of time, it almost seems silly, but here you are, you're sitting today. What do you do going forward? Well, you try to find something to anchor off of. So it's a discipline. It's a worthy experiment. I mean, if you're just willy-nilly kind of like, hey, this sounds pretty cool, and there's no justification, that's how you get into some of these companies that, yeah, if providing great return to your investors is simply identifying the most interesting, fastest growing business, this would not be a challenging business. It's why the new IPO that sounds really cool, maybe FedEx at the right price is going to provide the same return with less risk from now plus 3 years. Like it's the most competitive, interesting, difficult business to get right. It's just identifying the neatest companies is just, that's not a formula for success.
Despite your use of Snapchat and all.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I think I've observed you do this in interesting ways. One other position that we've overlapped with over time is PayPal. And even before COVID, you told me about building a scenario in your model for like a super ramp in net new users, right? And that was something that you were thinking about, which I had spoken with many investors about PayPal, and not many contemplated such a thing. And I thought that was really interesting, the way you kind of like specifically were toying with the numbers to see what it would do and how it would work and how you'd think about that.
Yeah, we had 4 different scenarios, and the share price, I guess to some extent you might say we were maybe a bit over arguing the case so that we could continue to own it. And, the best scenarios had some big nonlinear ads. This was not a prediction of a virus or anything like that, but these are very smart, very innovative people at the company, and we looked at it, and there were certain patterns that would reveal, more transactions per wallet as you add wallets and incremental transactions being profitable. The difference in earnings per share on the out years were quite massive. So we did find a way to justify continuing to own it. That was more of a hold decision rather than a buy decision. It should have been a buy decision with hindsight. But yeah, the world you model many times. Even us, we're only human. I think a lot of times you end up modeling to the stock price. It's kind of funny because in a weird way, you're modeling. When something's depressed and beat up, and Stitch Fix went down a bunch. We could take down our assumptions and still justify it. With a bias towards conservatism, you would tend to do that. Well, that doesn't mean what you had before was wrong. Maybe that's more right than what you're doing. I remember, many years ago, when we were modeling Netflix, we just got it wrong by a mile. I mean, they were such a much bigger than we ever would have imagined. So it's kind of funny. Like, again, it goes to like the what value does the model provide? I suppose at the end of the day, it provides a framework and discipline for beginning to assess the business and a management team. And look, I wouldn't frown upon people that are way more model driven and don't want to talk to management teams and are only looking at numbers. That there's certainly people that do that and they're good at it. They might tend to miss the transformation, that's going on, say, from DVDs by the mail to streaming, or from an apparel subscription business to some extent more of a traditional apparel retailer transformation that's occurring at Stitch Fix now. And that was not a segue to Stitch Fix. Keep asking away about my 24 years running this fund.
Well, no, I think it's just about time. But there's one more thing. Like, you're not exactly a technology investor, but you've had a great knack for finding interesting opportunities in technology and recognizing when, kind of regular things get impacted by tech. So, talk maybe about what brought you to Stitch Fix and how you see that playing out over time.
I try to read every interesting S1 for starters, and and the people I work with too. There's three of us looking for ideas, would do the same, and it just stuck out as something kind of interesting to me. And personally, I was a trunk club member for probably a decade plus, and I just kind of got a lot of value out of the service, and it kind of made my life easier. And so this was kind of a more, I'd say, more data-driven version of that. And so I kind of had some experience, I guess, as a consumer from subscription apparel. So, I remember reading the S1 and looking at it and think it was pretty interesting. And it wasn't losing a lot of money like a lot of other companies were. So I'm like, that was unique. That's different. And then I looked at, their ability to turn over their inventory was really impressive. They don't have to hold a lot of inventory to achieve the revenue they do. Their inventory turns are super impressive. So that kind of stuck out. And then I just, I put it up on my screen and read the next S1. And, a lot of times I'm waiting for a problem to occur or something, some catalyst that gets us to look at it again. I look at the people involved. Is it someone I know? Is there someone I could talk to? Maybe they'll have one thing to say that really gets my attention. I did a little bit of that with Stitch Fix. I didn't necessarily have, any green lights come back to me, right away on that. And then I think last summer, one of the guys in the group, we had visited the company in December of 19, my last trip right before COVID hit, one of the last trips. And we kind of put it up, on the shelf. And then someone in the office mentioned again that we ought to look at it last summer. And, perhaps the state of disarray and kind of traditional store-based apparel retailing would be in such bad shape that, digital players, online players might be advantaged. And we started thinking about it harder, started looking at it. And used the service. I used and abused the service. I asked for if they could give me a Style Pass membership. I think you have to be invited to it, and Style Pass allows you to get over the $20 hurdle. So they gave that to me, and I just like boom, I was hitting the service all the time. Kind of, it started. I started thinking it through. The service gets better with more use. I can't tell you how many managers I talked to that used the service once. I'm like, I didn't like anything. Well, I didn't like anything the first time I got it either, but I kind of kept going with it. The service does get better over time, and that's a survey of one. So it's like, it doesn't matter if you didn't like the clothes that you got. You'd have to talk to hundreds, if not thousands of people to kind of form a real opinion on that. So I just stayed with it, and we talked to them. We made our pitch. We said we're probably the kind of shareholders that you would like to attract. We had some folks in common, so we had people that were willing to say nice things about us, and so they opened up some to us. That I would say we've had to do a lot of work to understand it. It's not been easy by any stretch. I call it a narrow but navigable path. Sorry, it's. I see it pretty clearly, but I just don't think the path to success is easily observed from the outside. And it took us a while to get there. And again, when I say it's a narrow path, that means there's pitfalls to the left and right, but I think they can walk that path and they're going to get there. But I do not think it's easy. There's many aspects of this business, I think, that lend themselves to hot takes. It's commoditized. Oh, every e-commerce company has data scientists. There's a million people that do this, competing against Amazon, competing against Walmart. Everyone like that. I think, a hot take, 20,000-foot view would render them in the, put this in the nothing too special pile. I would see how most people would come to that conclusion. They read the 10K and maybe listened to a conference call or two.
Yeah, so you talk about a narrow path, right, and pitfalls on both sides. What are some of the pitfalls that you fear most, or that you think about most, that you need to address in understanding the path from here?
Yeah, a lot of it's just execution. It's a complicated business. No one's trying to do exactly what they're trying to do at scale. There's certainly other people trying to sell apparel and kind of more traditional store-based apparel, and traditional e-com apparel is going to sell plenty of items. But I don't think anyone's doing it in the way they're doing it. It's a complicated way, and just getting all the pieces right over time as they grow, at scale, having the right people involved, motivating people, all that stuff. It's a difficult thing to manage. Just again, like the evolution of Netflix from DVDs, now up to streaming globally. It took great execution over a long period of time, and that in of itself is a heavy lift. It's not easy to do. I don't think my fear of Amazon's going to come in and copy this model and do it better than them. I would say that's on the low side. My belief is the main risk is at this point, from my point of view, is simply execution. Can the team get it done? Can they add new countries and then replicate their success in those new countries and do it, in a manner and fashion that is acceptable to the marketplace, so it is allowed to perpetuate over time? And of course, having the right shareholders so you can get that done is crucial. That would be it. It's not some specific thing that, hey, Amazon is going to launch a competing service and the stock's going to go down 15% next week. That I'm kind of long past that. I think they're doing it in a differentiated enough way that it's kind of theirs to lose at this point, but it's going to need really good execution.
That makes sense. And you had mentioned like some of the hot takes, and I know I was guilty of one in the early going that you were quite constructive in helping me rethink a little bit, which is specifically this idea that churn has been pretty high historically at Stitch Fix, and they've gone through a whole lot of more customers than are actually still there today. And maybe talk a little bit about how you think of that instead of focusing on just churn and LTV of customers.
Yeah, I think it's a real interesting topic. For starters, I do think the way the company has done it is counterintuitive. It's not easy. Um, yeah, I think it would have been easier to do free delivery, free returns. Pick pick what you want, kind of just like everyone else does. I think they could have grown faster. Um, a couple different aspects. So, like, people don't think about what's the churn at, Nordstrom and Revolve and ASOS, right? They have this focus on churn because they've been subscription. But any subscription business, essentially, could be kind of thought of as traditional retail. It's like who are your customers? How much do they spend with you per year, per month, and whatnot. So I do think that they have some naturally occurring churn when you're on subscription and you fill up your closet. You're going to turn off the service for a while, and you might be completely satisfied with it, and you could churn out as a customer, and maybe you go back to the store or whatnot and you go about your business, and then you come back to it. So you have a bunch of inactive customers that have been satisfied with the service, that just they don't want another box sent to them, this month or next quarter. So it doesn't necessarily indicate dissatisfaction. You could have, a lot of people that come in and out of the service. This, Netflix showed this was true, and I think this is true of Stitch Fix. Then you have to kind of keep in mind that, the service is evolving pretty rapidly. This is, kind of arrogant to some extent, which is tell us something about yourself. We'll send you 5 things. You don't get to see what they are. Sorry. And if you don't like anything, we get to keep your $20. That's not an easy way to acquire customers. And so they're going to change that. They're going to show you what's in the box first. That's a huge change. The Trunk Club did that. I could see what was coming and say, don't send that, replace it with something else, and then it would come. And then they're adding the direct buy, which is going to be a bit more of kind of traditional e-commerce, and it's going to allow them to acquire customers in a different way. And so I kind of think more over when as these new services are added and it continues to evolve, it's going to be what's my wallet share with my active customers. It's not going to be what's churn. And I do think when you add previews and you add direct buy, by the way, I've said this in the tweet storm, I think I did on this, which is, if they're not able to more precisely match consumers with apparel, then I have almost no interest in this company. My belief is that they are doing a better job than others at that and will continue to do a better job over time. I think that when you add the new services in, it is going to bend these metrics. I think they'll reactivate their list of inactive customers at a higher rate than they have in the past. The customer acquisition costs will flex down. I think churn will flex down, and you'll get higher spend per active than you've gotten in the past when you add direct buy and Stitch Fix the fixes together. And I think eventually they're going to break the 5 in the box. They're going to go with more than 5. So the amount of items sold per fix is going to be better. And if they're doing a better job than the next person that's trying to do what they do, and I don't even think there's anyone trying to do what they do at scale right now, those are really hard things to achieve, and it'll change the narrative from what's the churn on this business to how much apparel they're selling. At what margin? What's their turnover? What's their profitability? So I think over time that will fade if I'm right about that. And I do think it's a big ask to say, hey, I need the data in the past when this service was maybe geared to kind of a more narrow set of people. To have that data Yeah, I guess I was like, it's to me, it's a big ask to expect um, some of their past metrics when the service, I think, appealed to more of a narrow base to capture kind of an evolving service that's going to address a lot more consumers a lot better than it will in the future.
Yeah, that's an interesting point. Like, I feel just watching my wife experiment with Stitch Fix and Direct Buy a little, it gives them a whole lot more. And I kind of like this phrase lately, but surface area to experiment, to engage with customers. One of the things I found interesting was with Direct Buy, if you see something while you're logged in that you like and you don't buy it, then it disappears and you can't necessarily find it easily. So it creates like an impulse to act. What are some of the other ways you think Direct Buy like meaningfully impacts the nature of the business and the relationship they have with their customers?
Yeah, I think it's going to give them more cracks at their existing customers. It's going to give them a better crack at a lot of customers that might not have liked the service. They have a tremendous amount of people that filled out the, their questionnaires but never took a first fix. And again, I think that that $20, like you don't get to see what it is, and you have to invest $20 in that box. It requires a tremendous amount of trust from consumers, and that won't be an issue going forward. I gotta say, one thing, we had a call recently with someone on the engineering team, and she said something that just absolutely I just loved. She said, I wish I could take credit for it, but I can't. She said, Stitch Fix works really well in soft goods where expressing preferences is difficult. And I just thought that was such an interesting way to explain it. And hopefully this will illustrate how difficult the problem is that they're trying to solve. Imagine trying to explain your style and preferences to a personal shopper that you never met before. Let's say it was going to be me. I'm going to be your personal shopper. I mean, where would you start? How long would it take? What would you say? Oh, I like red. Well, here's my size. I mean, can you imagine how long? And I want to do a really good job, and you're willing to invest time with me to get to this so I'm a good personal shopper for you. I mean, it would be a real challenge. It's really difficult to express, what Elliot likes to wear. I mean, I see you got a T-shirt on today, but it's not an easy thing at all. So to kind of get that right, if you think about it, it is not going to be easy. So I really loved hearing that. And they might not even get it right, even when you give them all the data. So I think to me that was super interesting to hear from someone on the team, and it got me thinking about a lot of different things about how we buy big ticket items, how we buy low ticket items, and essentially, I think this is a Cebelli original, but I was thinking the other day about the personalization aspect. Traditional e-commerce outsources personalization to the consumer. So kind of like go on, on a website, sort by shirt, this style, color, this and that. And it's kind of like you do the work. You figure it out. They're outsourcing that. Well, Stitch Fix is offering to do the opposite of that. You outsource it to us. You tell me something about yourself, and I'll come up with your preferences. And I'll start with a much narrower list of options that you'll be interested in. And I just kind of thought about that. And I don't think anyone else is really trying to do that. Sure, everyone's like personalization. It's an easy word to throw around. But for the most part, traditional e-commerce, they're leaving it up to the customer to personalize. And that requires time, energy, and effort. Stitch Fix is flipping that, saying, we're going to do it for you. Outsource it to us. We're pretty good at it. And that potentially is a very, very valuable thing. When their feed is showing me things time and time again that I would like, and I have confidence in the fit, they know how much what proportion and all that kind of stuff, size I wear, length, everything like that. And they're showing me something new, not something, many things new every day. Well, that's a very valuable tool. Of course, I'll glance at that. So the frequency, by the way, on their app, when you're not just doing the auto ship, think about the difference in frequency that I might open that app and look at it and say, well, what do they think I'll like today? What do you think? Then tomorrow I'll do it. It's potentially, it's really a game changer. I do think, not unlike, I don't want to keep torturing Netflix here, but like it could look, it's so different than what it looks like now in a few years that it'll be almost unrecognizable.
Yeah, that's really interesting to me because, like, when we look at shopping online and we look at the digital world, effectively everything is full of abundance and you're overwhelmed by choice. Like, I do find it overwhelming when I try to buy just about anything online, right? And you use certain things to try to like narrow your vector and focus it. So if I'm buying a TV, I'll probably search for like TV reviews from a couple trusted people and try to like narrow the scope. Obviously, I'd look at a Roku TV, but that's neither here nor there. But in Stitch Fix case, apparel is especially hard because there are two challenges buying online. One is, you're facing incredible abundance, but the second layer of the challenge is you still don't even know when it goes in the box and you get a shipping confirmation that when it comes, it's going to be the same on you as it like with a TV. I know if I bought a good TV, I slap it on my wall, it's fine. But with clothes, I'm going to want to try them on and make sure they actually fit and that, it goes just right. So, I think that's really interesting the way you phrase it about kind of flipping the way that e-com works. And maybe one of the things I wonder about is, you've talked about data. To me, the obvious things on data stand out where, like they have a pretty good sense of what my shape is based on the measurements I give them, based on what I keep and what I send back. But how does like data inform stylistically what I'd want? Like, how does it fill the funnel of what I'd want to purchase in that way?
Yeah, the last time I talked about this on a podcast, this was one area that we were a bit less informed on. I had, my instinct told me certain things, but we've become more informed on this. And so it's a great topic to dive into. They have 150 plus people dedicated on their data science team. And to me, I've called this kind of money ball for apparel. These are not fashion people. Now, clearly they have some fashion people there, but at their core, at their heart, originally, these were data-driven engineers, data science people that took very fresh approaches to kind of problem solving here. So I guess one of the things I like to say now, or one of the ways I like to think about it, is that I don't think there's a bigger team of data scientists in the world working on apparel retailing problems, apparel selling problems, sourcing problems than this team. And that's an advantage. And it reminds me of Netflix. Netflix, they weren't Hollywood people, they weren't media people, they were problem solvers from the Bay Area, and they went on and did amazing things. I see the same potential setup here. And that's going to be something that evolves over time, and I can't quite model that. I mean, I don't know how do you input that into a model, kind of like how we were discussing before. But these are very bright people, and it's abundantly clear to me that they are now considered a potential destination by serious data engineers, data analytics people, that they would compete at very high levels for talent, along with top companies. And again, it's a little bit, I guess, ironic because the person we talked to mentioned this to us. Like it's fair for me to say, which is you wouldn't say data scientists necessarily had the best fashion. So for them to kind of end up solving problems at apparel shop is kind of interesting. But they've clearly staked out a bit of a reputation here, and when I think about compounding that over time, that's super interesting. I've said this to some other people and applies to other businesses as well. Stitch Fix doesn't have to be twice as good as the competition. If they're 15 to 20% better than the competition in a bunch of KPIs over time, they can just drive that into tremendous scale. So again, I would have very little interest in this business if the next best competitor sending out a box had 2 items kept per fix, and we're at 2. If if we're at 2.4 and the competition is killing themselves to get to 2.1, like they can work with that. They can work with that over time. They're doing something better, and they're just going to keep driving that advantage, like on top of it, on top of itself over and over again, and continuing to innovate. It just, I think that that is just a really interesting dynamic that they're taking a highly analytical, data-driven process to, I would say, an industry that historically, hasn't attracted those kinds of people or had that kind of decision making underlying their business. That's not to say that there aren't other companies in apparel that have smart people working on problems, but at this size, at this scale, in the Bay Area, it's super interesting. It's super interesting to us how that can evolve over time.
Yeah, and so like data informs, your fit, informs what sorts of apparel is curated in your fixes and in your feed on direct buy, but does it also play a role in advantaging Stitch Fix and how they acquire customers, how they engage with their customers and try to activate purchases? Like, what other layers do they apply data that we might not be thinking about?
And that became very clear to me on the call that the expansion of the data science team is kind of permeating in through other areas of the organization, including customer acquisition costs. So it's starting to permeate, all decisions that were made. I mean, you do see it in the inventory turns. And like, look, I mean, I think the inventory turns slowed down last quarter, but everyone's anticipating like a big rush, of business. So like, they're building up their inventory some to kind of be ready for kind of the world kind of turning over and, anniversarying virus life. But yeah, one of the things that became very clear to us is that it permeates the organization. And that wasn't just from one call. I mean, I've talked to people that know, former employees and people that work closely with this management team. It's part of their culture. It's in their DNA. They're not throwing darts. They're not saying, not guessing, hey, I think red's going to be, big this year, and, forest green's going to make a comeback. That's kind of not what they do. And I just love that. I think that is a super important thing. It's hard to build a culture like that. I think they have.
And, how do you think about the impact that COVID has had on them? Because when I think of their wheelhouse customer heading into 2020, I mean, maybe I'm wrong here, and correct me if I am, but I think like working millennial woman first and foremost. And like there's probably a great degree to which their demand heading into 2020 was for clothes that are worn in the work environment. And then suddenly you end up in this like yoga pants and t-shirt world. Like how did that impact them, and what do you think happens on the way out? And is there different data that they needed to fulfill their customers' missions before, during, and maybe soon to be after COVID?
Yeah, well, you can update your information. So if you've gained weight or lost weight, I think you would tend to do that, naturally and easily, and that would inform them. There's lots of signals that they get from their customers. What they buy, what they keep, the questionnaires, any changes there. I mean, that's kind of the secret sauce, essentially. But another very, very important aspect to me here is very different than traditional e-commerce. Is that I don't think of Stitch Fix as a brand really. And it is a brand, but it's more of a service than a brand. And so, it should work in other countries. It should work with any human, male, female, children, whatever. It's not closely associated with a particular demo, despite, I think, the fact that I think a lot of their original customers probably were, females that were busy and were outsourcing kind of selection to them, and that was kind of their core market. But they've added countries and they've added lines, and last summer was super interesting. The the percentages of what they sold changed rather dramatically, and they rolled with that. And I do think, by the way, you could tap into this with some research. Vendors love them. They're very different. They don't do markdowns. When Stitch Fix pays you, it's money good. It's your money. Maybe that'll change at one point in the future, but they're not like the department stores where they're overbuying inventory and then kind of, having, if something takes off, they have enough and then they can get the markdowns and all that kind of stuff. It's very, very different. So they do much more precise buys, than other retailers. And the vendors appreciate that. And when they really like getting, that 100 cents on the dollar and keeping it. It's theirs to keep. It allows them to plan their business much better. So one of the things I really like is that, again, you kind of forward roll this over time, is that, as they get better, they're going to, the vendors will have to work, certain vendors will work better with them to add speed and efficiency and get better and better and better, be more responsive to the consumer base. Is just something that I think over time is another way for them to win. And I do think that, look, their inventory models, they position the inventory. Look, they've turned it over pretty nicely. So, their gross profit dollars are to me, are cash good. There's a lot of cash that the business spends off. But, over time, I think they're absolutely going to be adding different inventory models. So, maybe they maybe a little bit look like QVC. QVC, you rent time from QVC, guaranteed minimums, percentage of sales, and they don't have to position the inventory. I think their core business will have them continuing to position inventory over time, but their feed, if you will evolve and will probably have sponsored listings and other things where they're not positioning the inventory themselves, so they can offer a greater selection and a lower capital intensity. I mean, I think that is absolutely in the cards for this company. Again, if they're doing a better job, if you didn't believe this, and if I don't believe it and you didn't believe it, like, you wouldn't want to own shares in the company. If they're not doing a better job of getting units in front of you that are more appealing than the next person, then it's all for naught. It doesn't matter. I believe that they're capable of doing that. I believe they're going to do a better job of doing that. And if they are over time, that's going to really open the door to alternative kind of inventory models for them, which would be just absolutely beneficiary, including sponsored listings. Straight up ad revenue over time. We've built in a small amount of high margin ad revenue kind of in the out years of our model. We think that that's very, very realistic.
Yeah, that's all really interesting. You started with saying that Stitch Fix is a service, not a brand. And I was thinking to myself, yeah, it's a great service for a customer, but really what you're talking about is it's also a service for the apparel brands in a different way.
Yeah, I mean, I also think that's it's a great way to move inventory. It's a great way to help plan your business, and also it's a customer acquisition tool. They tell you what the brand is. And when you get it, you clearly can see the brand. And if most all these brands, their private labels would be the case, but all the other brands that they sell would be trying to sell directly to consumers. So, to some extent, Johnny O and Fairdy, they could put some inventory out, and they have with Stitch Fix, and it's a customer acquisition tool for them because they have a really good product. Yeah, I'm going to go to their site and maybe buy some directly, which I have done, in a natural way on my own, not just because I'm analyzing Stitch Fix. So I do think it's also a customer acquisition tool for some good brands. It really has the potential. Look, part of me just is like thinks of them getting more scale and adding more overhead and hiring that incremental, data engineer and incremental, bright, motivated, fashion person and marketing person, and just that the organization could really, really kind of hum over time and be a difficult one to dislodge from the high ground in apparel. I do not think it's going to be easy. This is when I was on the other podcast with Patrick, I kind of talked about the DC. So I don't think it makes too much sense to talk about the DC, but I guess that gets into the whole, the multitude of things that have to be run run well for this thing to work. They have a canvas. They have a very nice canvas to kind of paint from. They have a nice business that's allowed them to add scale. They make a little bit of money, they lose a little bit. They're kind of like they're not fun. They're not in danger of needing funding. And from here, what can you do with it? You have all these smart people. You have this big data analytics team trying to solve problems that most companies are trying to solve. Where can they go? What can they do? How can they make their service better? And we've been very impressed. With everyone we've met has been super bright, super motivated, really creative here. I'm as impressed as I could be with the team.
Yeah, that's all really interesting. I wonder, when I think about like PayPal, one of the things that's gone right with it, issuers started steering their own cardholders to use PayPal to make their credit card the first choice within the digital wallet. Do you think there's a path to them having brands steer people to engage, apparel brands, steer some of their customers to try to find them on Stitch Fix first? Like, is that a possibility, or do you think brands would be more focused on trying to pull people into their own DTC channels? And part of what I'm wondering about in general, like more high level, is there a path to them like driving down customer acquisition costs over time?
Yeah, well, I definitely think there's, by adding previews and adding direct buy, which is kind of more traditional e-commerce, with hopefully our better touch at figuring out what you want. Those are definitely things that should benefit customer acquisition costs over time and open up the addressable market. So remind me what you asked, the other part of the question, first part of the question.
Well, brands inevitably have some sort of incentive, like given Stitch Fix is a service, not a brand itself, to try to steer people into engage, like customers to buy their brand through Stitch Fix.
Yeah, well, I would say, I kind of think, there'll be first and foremost, a brand would love to sell directly off their website and not have to get told by anyone else. They'd love to do it without Facebook or Instagram or Google kind of getting in the way. But, reality is, they have their whole business they have to manage, and they're going to have some high cost, customer acquisition channels and lower cost ones. They'll focus on the lower cost ones, but they have fixed expenses to leverage just like anyone else. So they're not going to, they ignore a high cost channel at their own peril that could cost them over time. So, I would say that Stitch Fix is probably a higher cost channel for some of these brands, but not an unreasonable one to work with. Especially given what I kind of said, they're not looking to charge back and do the discount. So it's kind of money good. And I do think, they're going to have something to say, which is, hey, if I'm a particular brand and I'm coming out with a line and I'm a well-known brand, like Stitch Fix could go to them and say, we have 250,000 people that we think would love to buy that, and we can pinpoint them better than you. Sell through us. Here, pay for a sponsored listing up here. We'll put you in the upper left corner. You'll be the first thing that they see when they log on, and we're gonna find them better than you. And they know us, they trust us, they're great customers. We're gonna put half them in your in your new outfit or new style or whatever you're doing. Absolutely, I think that's a business model. They may not even have to own any of that inventory. Maybe they're just taking a commission back, or advertising or something there. So I think that is a likely outcome as they continue to evolve. Yeah, it would be a higher cost channel. I mean, certainly, you would love to sell directly off your own website without anyone interfering, of course, but. The world's too competitive for that to happen. We all know that.
Right. They could literally spoon feed the demand to them, right?
Yeah. That's why we own some of the gatekeepers like Facebook and whatnot and other things, right?
There you go, right? Customer acquisition is the revenue opportunity for Zuckerberg. How do you size up the valuation here? How do you size up the risk reward and all that?
Yeah, we have some, pretty chunky numbers that we look at kind of on the out years, something in the order of 500 to 600 million of EBITDA, a few years out, it may play out that way. It may not. They may have a lot more revenues and choose to suppress profitability, and keep going forward. I certainly think adding new countries in the near term will suppress overall profitability, but you can kind of do the analysis there where you back some of that out. So if they do 500 or 600 million in adjusted EBITDA in a few years, I kind of think that would be probably provide a pretty darn good return from here. So we kind of have that mapped out in our head as something that we think is reasonable. That's using a well below the margin guidance that they gave for long-term margins. So I think there's some conservatism in that. And that assumes a certain growth rate in direct buy, which is be higher than the fixes. Assumes a declining, all the details. Again, I don't think this is a good format to go over all the details, but it kind of assumes a declining rate of growth for fixes. It assumes some annual depreciation in the price of the units that they sell. It assumes a bit of a lift as they break, I think potentially break, the 5 barrier on, how many things are in the fix. A little bit of lift in units per fix sold. We kind of net it all out, and that's what we get. So to me, that would be a 500 or 600 million EBITDA. In 3 to 4 years would be a pretty good outcome. But they can miss it by a mile, or they could do better than that. My instinct would be that if they miss it, it will be because they've entered more markets and there's more growth and there's more investment going on, because it's working. And so you could achieve less profitability than that, but have it become more clear to investors that this is a retailer that's going everywhere. It's going to a lot of different places. I do think, look, I'll just flat out say it. I think they have a chance of being one of the biggest apparel retailers in the world. Like they're gonna be up there. They're gonna be one of the big ones. They have a shot at that, a real shot at that. I'm not saying it's 100% absolutely going to happen, but I think they have a real shot at it. That's the opportunity. That's what they're playing for. One of the biggest apparel retailers in the world, including store-based.
It's a pretty massive ambition. And so, a lot of what you're saying boils down to their ability to execute on it, right? And that comes down to the people and some of the people involved. So maybe talk about management, leadership, and, some of the key figures who will be kind of guiding the way there.
Yeah. So, before I even get into that, they have almost 6,000 stylists. I think that we have them, that we think that costs 150 to 160 million annually right now. I mean, can you imagine? That's a big ticket. And, again, they're very analytical and very data driven. I'm sure they've done the test. They have the recommendation, from their algos, and they could say, could we do this? Could we do the same outcomes, same keep rate without the stylists? And I think it's quite apparent that the stylists add value. So could you just imagine, for starters, that much spent annually from this company if you kind of want to be in this business, assuming that the algorithm alone won't get you the result that you want? Because if it did, my instinct would be that would be exactly how they would do it, and it's not how they're doing it. So that's just an interesting investment they have to make kind of every quarter, every year. That appears to be justified. Yeah, we've met with Katrina, we've met with Liz Spalding, Dan Jetta, the CFO. We met with their head of U.S. operations, Rufus. We got pretty friendly with Mike Smith, who left the company. We met with one of their data analytics engineers recently. So we've met with a lot of people, and that's just through them. We've done other research on our own, and it's a talented group. Again, I'll just summarize to say I don't think there is a group this big, this smart, this motivated working on apparel retailing problem solving like that at scale. There's certainly big groups working on other things, like the Oculus at Facebook and how to turn Instagram into a mall. There are other groups, but I don't think there's another group that's this big dedicated to solving problems specifically in apparel, e-commerce, retailing. Right? And if there is, I hope someone tells me who it is and what that company is.
Yeah, the stylist point is huge because, we started on Stitch Fix. You mentioned the hot takes that you see from so many people. And one of the hot takes is like, well, they talk about all this data. And then at the end of the day, a stylist is involved in sending people their fix. Like, how could it be data when you need a human? And, one of the concepts I'd been exposed to was the Kasparov principle from the chess grandmaster about this idea that, the question's not binary. It's not computer or human. It's when you add a human's capabilities and a human's expertise to really good data, the outcome is much better than either or. And that kind of debones the hot take that, like, how could this data company rely on stylists?
Yeah, well, I think what happens. That there's a ranking. There's a predictive ranking, and then that ranking is ranked from most likely to be kept to, less likely to be kept. Most of the stylists choose, from that top 10. So there's some deviation, but not a tremendous amount. So, they look, robots don't make good short order cooks, and probably never will, most likely. Don't quote me there. There's still value that's added by reading the comments and looking at things, and that makes sense to do. And again, it's a very big investment. I mean, I talked about on the podcast just the silly little fact on Patrick's podcast, just to be clear, that they take apart all the apparel so it's ready to be tried on. It just sounds so silly. But if you just think about how much time and convenience that adds, if you did it the other way, you would still be taking the stuff apart and just getting it ready to be tried on. Stitch Fix, you could in theory try it on, send it back in the box, and now the other person would be like, okay, now I'm ready to try it on. They spend a lot of money for that little win. It's a little win. It's kind of, when I think about that, like, just reminds me of the stylist. That's a lot of money for maybe a little win, just a little win.
So I'm
that's how you get to live against Amazon. That's how you get to stay alive against some pretty darn competitive folks, as we've talked about from time to time.
Absolutely. That's interesting because, like, I wonder, it makes me wonder, was that something that they did from day one, or did they have a point where they're like, let's test this and see what return rates are like across, A/B tested, see which group has a better rate of retention with what they order. You know what I mean?
Yeah, that I don't know. I don't know the history there. I could guarantee, though, that they did a lot of A/B testing. I don't know who came first. Excuse me, the algo or the stylist. I guess I would guess the stylist, but I actually don't know the answer to that one. Good question.
Got it. Okay, so let's close the loop here. We just talked about competing with Amazon, and at the very beginning, I talked about how we met over Grubhub during one of those moments when people were talking about Amazon's competition challenging Grubhub's competitive position. But food delivery, while Grubhub is kind of resolved in its own way, is still top of mind for you. I've seen a couple recent tweet storms, and you have some interesting thoughts on the space. So maybe want to go over a couple things that you're thinking about there.
Yeah, well, I guess just flat out, I think Takeaway probably is the cheapest scale delivery company in the world today. So that's kind of interesting. They're asset rich. They have some really good assets. And the pro forma company, right, is going to have a great German business, a great Netherlands business, a very good UK business. They have a tremendous Northeast business, and they have an absolute gem in New York City. And I do think urban areas and urban environments are not going to permanently disappear. So I do think the relative growth rate of the urban, generally speaking, marketplace probably will compare more favorably to the logistics / suburban growth rate that we've kind of seen over 2020. But I think it's deeply undervalued. I don't think a lot of people would necessarily disagree with that. They might say, well, oh, okay, it's cheap and undervalued, but what are the catalysts? I might say, yeah, maybe there's some, maybe you're right there. We've identified something that's, cheap with some super attractive assets in a business, I think, whose end state, everyone's playing in it for a reason. I think there's the belief that the end state will be a consolidated, very attractive business that's tolling kind of operators, for on-demand delivery. But I would say that there are potentially some catalysts here as well, which makes it interesting. I think simply closing the Grubhub deal will add some clarity to the situation. We do have a CEO of the pro forma company, Yitzi, that has a fairly big stake, and he doesn't strike me as the type of CEO that's going to be okay with the shares languishing for too long. I mentioned the relative strength of the urban marketplaces versus suburban logistics operations. That's likely to improve over the course of this year. And I think another one is just the expansion of the addressable market to grocery, local commerce, on-demand convenience commerce, whatever you want to call it. And then likely at one point, faster delivery times or some move from Amazon. I don't think it's just going to concede this space to GoPuff and DoorDash without a fight. It opens the door to another round of M&A in the space. So I do think ultimately, some of these properties will change hands and consolidate, and you'll get to that end state at one point, and that end state's attractive. So I think this is an asset-rich company that's undervalued with some, I'll call it, maybe soft catalysts. Just another really interesting thing is that they have some big, smart, motivated, constructive shareholders. Takeaway: the pro forma company is going to have some great shareholders that I think are going to, that they're not going to be okay with the shares being perpetually undervalued. And I don't think the CEO will be either. So, I think there's some moves that could be made and things they could do to kind of highlight the value. So I view it as one where there's probably pretty limited downside risk, all other things being equal. So that's attractive. And look, I'd say, to me, there's no doubt. One of the things we do is we kind of look at what's the underlying profitability. The marketplaces are profitable. New York City's profitable. London's profitable. Some of these countries are profitable, and I'm kind of doing, pre-overhead contribution margin. These are profitable businesses, so you can make some assumptions saying, well, what's this kind of a steady state analysis look like? Let's give up on hyper growth. Let's get down to the core business. What's more of a kind of sustainable spend? What would the margin be? And I think at this point, takeaway, is well covered by that theoretical value. I think that theoretical value, I'd say on the low end, some of these properties would be worth 12 times that kind of underlying contribution margin, and easily 15 times on some of the key marquee properties that they have. That gets us to 105, roughly on takeaway versus the current prices, which is a pretty big discount. So you're left with a situation where I think the companies are trading at a substantial discount to kind of a theoretical underlying profitability basis, which a strategic acquirer would be. The strategic acquirer wouldn't need all the corporate overhead. You add a seamless New York City, into an existing operator's business. There's a really nice payback in that, and I do think, that the window, the opportunity for some additional transactions, additional M&A in the space will happen when as more people wade into the space, and all these guys are, all these operators are kind of be like, well, we'll fetch anything for anyone anywhere. That really expands the market. So I think it's overly depressed at these prices. I know you know it well, so we could have a real conversation about this one.
Yeah, don't think I didn't notice you said seamless about New York City too. I see what you did there. One of the big things I wonder about when Yitzhak went and won the German market, he was basically anointed the champion of the entire space. He was given the world's highest valuation, whatever metric you want to measure, like EBITDA. Like price to EBITDA, price to sales, EV to GMV, whatever it may be. And then, with COVID, every company in this industry was treated tremendously by the market. Everyone got their valuations marked up from where it was, and Takeaway was no different until they announced the acquisition of Grubhub. And then, the question overhanging the entire space was, is this a defensive move by Takeaway, or is this an offensive move? And, what does it mean? I'm curious your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I guess I don't feel the need to pontificate on that at this point. The deal is probably a done deal, and I'm evaluating what I'm buying today, at current prices, and I think I'm getting a really good deal. I'm not exactly sure why Takeaway wanted to acquire Grubhub. I think they got some great assets. I think the marketplace was probably wanting to see kind of more synergies. And I certainly a year ago would have liked to see, a merger kind of in the US with a, true elimination of a competitor, but it didn't happen. And now I'm just kind of evaluating today kind of, what's the opportunity? What's the valuation? What do I think it's worth? And again, they have some tremendous assets. If you, I think using some estimates we think are reasonable. I think seamless New York City is, in Postmates, we're probably, somewhat similar sized. If you kind of put, Postmates valuation, plus, maybe 2.75 billion on the iFood stake that Takeaway owns. This is well over a quarter of the capitalization, the pro forma capitalization of Takeaway. That's just two things. That's seamless New York City, which clearly people would love to own. And I said 15 times. Well, people would probably pay more than 15 times for that. Could you imagine adding that into a break-even, say, logistics business, kind of in the tri-state area? That marketplace, the profitability without the corporate overhead on that, probably pay more than 15 times, for that. Those two things, seamless New York City alone, plus iFood at, a potential, market value, that's over a quarter of the enterprise value here. And you got Germany, you got Netherlands, you got UK, you would have a lot of other cities, in the US. It's too cheap. And, the marketplace has been somewhat enamored by the logistics player, though maybe a little bit less recently. And maybe now it's the first party, fully integrated, direct seller, dark store, GoPuff model. That's true first party now. But I do think there's an underappreciation of the marketplaces. And, the thing number one, observation number one, when Uber Eats was first attacking this business many years ago and was going to, quote, like kill them, crush them, was this is a sticky app. It still is. It's a sticky app. Look at eBay. That's a sticky app. Oh, eBay is not growing. eBay lost on the Amazon. You're like, yeah, all those things are true, but it's still there. It's still churning out profitability. Actually, they had a pretty good year last year. Not bad, right? And, this seamless app will be used it'll be used 2 decades from now in New York City. I'm sorry. They probably won't even change the brand. It's a sticky app. It's valuable. We're all focused on the end state. And Takeaway and Yitzi have a very nice opportunity from the current levels because the market is underestimating him and the marketplaces, at this point. So he also has a nice canvas to which to paint a masterpiece.
All right. Well, on that note, I think we'll take a wrap here. Congratulations on 24 years. Really nice canvas that you've painted and keep painting to this day. And thank you so much for your friendship and mentorship along the way. It means a lot for you to join me here today as well.
Yeah, I got to throw you a bone. I mean, obviously, I appreciate being on here and whatnot, but I will say that you've been one of the more creative, brighter stock pickers that I've come across on Twitter. So it's a pleasure talking to you. It's not a burden by any stretch. I enjoy our conversation and hearing your ideas, and I should have listened to you on a number of things over the past couple of years that you've done so well on. So congrats to you.
Thank you. Well, likewise. Can't catch them all, right? All right.